Is Vermintide or Darktide the harder game? This is a question I've been hearing while in the Tide community for quite a while now. Originally, I did not believe this was a question that could or should be answered because Fatshark had not yet had the time to tweak Darktide's balance to their standard of perfection. Now that it's been 8 months and multiple balance patches have been put out to address both weapons and enemies though, I think there isn't a more perfect time to finally settle this debate and determine which game is more difficult. Before we begin though, I want to define two specific terms I will be referring to throughout this video, and for the record, I don't think these are terms that existed prior to this, I just made them up to help prove my points. The first of these terms is micro-gameplay, which refers to aspects of gameplay that you have direct control over and directly affect. This includes your weapon choices, talent choices, weapon combos you use while you fight, how you use one-time consumable items, and so on. The other term, macro gameplay, refers to how you use your micro gameplay and general knowledge to make overarching strategic decisions, or in other words, how you would react to things within the game that are out of your control, which includes things like map selection via quick play, the AI director, consumable item spawns, your teammates and everything about them, including their build and how they play, and so on. When it comes to determining the difficulty of both games, it's imperative to look at both their micro and macro gameplay first. First, let's look at micro gameplay. In Vermintide, matching your weapons to complement each other is an important part of gameplay, and each weapon has its obvious upsides and downsides that you have to take into account, save for a few outliers. Talent selection and synergy with your weapons is also of vital importance, as a mismatch between your weapons and talents can lead to some severe issues while in-game, and all of this extends to Darktide as well. Combat is also quite difficult, as enemies are a serious threat. Every single hit you take drains a limited resource via your health pool, which you can restore through limited and randomly spawned healing items. Temp health aids to offset the need to heal when your health gets low, but in order to build temp HP, you must put yourself in harm's way by directly fighting in melee, which requires you to be skilled. Armored units are a significant threat as they can one-shot a large chunk of the roster, and Chaos Warriors specifically cannot be staggered except through a few select means. Berserkers and monks have the ability to bring you from full health to dead in literal seconds, and all specials are unique and force you to adapt accordingly. Positioning is important, but as long as you stay close to your team, you'll mostly be alright. In Darktide, however, combat is quite different. Every hit you take at max toughness is fully negated, which partially negates the feeling of your health feeling like a limited resource. Health is restored both through medkits as well as Medicae stations, the former of which are somewhat common and the latter of which are very common and very predictable as they spawn in the same place every run. Downs are also tied to the amount of wound trinkets you run instead of capped at 1, which makes death more forgiving in the higher difficulties. Toughness can be gained by running away from combat and hiding so long as you stay close to your team, and in Veteran's case, you don't even need to stay with your team. Armored units can still one-shot, but toughness gating prevents this from happening most of the time, and all armored units can be staggered fairly easily. Berserkers attack slow enough to not kill you quicker than you can blink, but toughness gaining would have prevented this anyway had their attack speed been faster. Positioning, however, is of the utmost importance, as bad positioning can get you stun-locked and deleted by ranged units in the blink of an eye. Now, let's shift over to the macro gameplay. In Vermintide, macro gameplay is a bit simpler. When you load into the keep before a game, you can see the careers and loadout of your teammates, which easily lets you adapt your own to theirs. Team synergy is important in Vermintide, but it's not as important beyond do we have boss damage and super armor damage, as highly skilled players can easily fill the other required roles. Consumable items are usually commonly found due to how many of them there actually are in games, 7 of them to be precise, so typically you will always have some kind of consumable to work with unless you're hit with a nasty streak of bad luck. The AI director is admittedly a bit random though, with some games feeling like it's on its lunch break while others feel like it has a personal grudge against you. In Darktide, when you load into a pregame lobby, you cannot see the loadout your team is running, so you can't adapt your own loadout to them, and you cannot change your career unless you back out of the lobby, making it virtually impossible to synergize with random teams except through chance. This is a huge shame, as team synergy is very important in Darktide, as roles are inherently less flexible than Vermintide, which require you to synergize more with your team. Consumable items are more limited in Darktide, with there only being 2, so you overall have less supplies to work with, even though they spawn a bit more frequently. The AI director is fairly stable throughout the match, meaning you can get a good idea of what your game is going to be like within the first 5 or so minutes. So, what does all of this tell us? When comparing the two games, we can conclude that the micro gameplay of Vermintide is more difficult, as the combat is much more punishing and skill-intensive than in Darktide due to toughness gating, even though positioning does tend to matter much more in Darktide. Macro gameplay, on the other hand, tends to be more difficult in Darktide due to some balancing differences between the two games, but mostly due to a lack of quality-of-life features that should have carried over from Vermintide. So, which game is more difficult? Truth be told, it really depends on the individual player. If you think that combat is the hardest part to master in the Tide games, then you may think Vermintide is harder, but if you tend to think that figuring out consumable usage and positioning is more difficult, then you could make the argument that Darktide is harder. Personally though, here is my opinion. The difficulty of Darktide has overall sharper spikes due to the existence of more dangerous ranged units, especially during moments of ranged unit spam. As someone who has spent thousands of hours mastering the melee combat of the Tide games, I personally find Darktide more difficult and taxing to play because ranged units are so much more difficult to deal with compared to melee units, and my knowledge of melee combat is heavily negated when I am put up against a room full of shooters with near-perfect accuracy. However, I understand that my situation is not the norm, as the vast majority of people are very experienced in FPS combat and have zero experience with Tide game melee combat. This is why I would agree that overall Vermintide is the more difficult game due to how punishing its melee combat can be, and since there is literally no other game on the market like it, it's impossible to come in with any prior experience to lean on. To be clear, I'm not saying that Darktide being easier is bad, I'm just saying that it's different, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Everyone enjoys something different in games, and I don't think it's inherently a bad thing for a game to be easier than its predecessor. But of course, this is simply my opinion. Thanks for watching, and thanks to this month's Patreons for their continued support. Make sure to like and subscribe for more Tide content like this in the future. See y'all next time!